question with this project with three core questions. The first is about implementation. How did folks in the schools experience blended learning? What did it mean for them? What did it look like? The second is about outcomes. We started thinking about academic outcomes and looking at student performance data over time, but we broadened that over time to think about perceived outcomes, and we got at that through some survey data as well. And then we looked at finances. As I'm sure many of you know, many schools come into blended learning with the idea that they can save money, and this is a good mechanism for that. So we looked at how schools spent their money when implementing blended learning, but then also, did it save money? We looked at that quantitatively and qualitatively. So our data sources were many. We had site visits with interviews, focus groups, and observations, 2 rounds of parent, teacher, and student surveys, student performance data for as many years as the schools could provide us, and then self-reported finance data from the schools. We provided the schools with a template. 2 of the schools were able to fill that out, but we knew that it was a big lift for the schools, so from the other 2 schools, we got kind of piecemeal data. So I wouldn't trust the finance data to the number, but overall, it makes, we got consistent data from folks. So I'm sure that many of you haven't been to both schools and aren't entirely sure of what this looks like. Blended learning, Primer, is just a combination of face-to-face and virtual education. Station rotation is when students move in small groups from, with the student, or with the teacher rather, and project-based learning, and then independent time on the computers. It doesn't have to be project-based learning, it can be independent work, or it could just be 2 stations.
Tricia, we're going to provide this to the participants, right, or Rachel? So you don't need to...
We have to make sure that it will actually happen.
So we should send out the sign-up sheet?
But it can't hurt to take pictures.
Okay. I'm going to send out a sign-up sheet, and if you put your email, we will...
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. So there are different forms of blended learning. Station rotation is one of the primary models that we see particularly in elementary schools, and that's what we saw largely in the bold schools as well. Some of the older grades experimented a little bit with flex, where they gave students a little bit more autonomy around their time use, and flipped, where students watched instruction at home by video and then applied that in class. But mostly it was station rotation, and mostly in math and reading, although we did see some experimentation and an expansion of blended learning in social studies, science, and Hebrew over time. There was a pretty high degree of fidelity, but that varied. We asked students on a survey how often they used computers as a typical part of instruction, and the students reporting computer use at least a few times per week ranged from 68% to 86%. So some variation, and I understand that doesn't get at all the nuances of blended learning, but at least gives you an idea of what this looked like in the schools. So I know I have to make time for Tricia, so I'll get right into findings. One of our key implementation findings was about communication in these schools and how that was challenged in a lot of these settings. You have many stakeholder interests in any organization at all. Here, this is just a few of the stakeholders, and I'm sure you can think of many more. But one of the key tensions at the beginning of this work was between the funding coalition and adults in the schools. The funders came in with big ideas. They said, we have this idea, we think we can save money and reduce costs in schools. We think we can improve the academic achievement in schools and just make this schools better places on a variety of dimensions using blended learning. And we think that it can get started in 3 months. So here's some funding, and let's go. And I see some smiles. Folks balked at this, right? They said, well, this is great. We definitely can make use of the money, and we think that it's a good idea, but we need to provide professional development. We have to get our heads around what blended learning is. We need to vet software and buy equipment and make changes to our school infrastructure. And there was a lot of back and forth between the folks in the schools and the funders about this and how quickly blended learning could realistically happen in a productive way. So that was a first tension that, by many accounts, left left a bad taste in folks' mouths for much of the grant period. But there was also some misaligned priorities within the schools. Heads of schools, school principals, blended learning leads, and teachers. And I should say that every school had an in-house blended learning lead, which is different than some other blended schools that I've been in. But all of these individuals come at the work from a unique perspective and weren't always kind of rowing in the same direction. So one example comes from a school where a blended learning lead had worked to get carols in the school so that students could focus while they were doing their independent work. And a different school leader came in and said, this is not aesthetically pleasing, it doesn't match the rest of our school, get them out. Right? So that sort of misalignment in how folks were seeing the work, the goals of the work, how to get to the end results was problematic. And towards the end of the grant, I think that we saw more communication in the schools about this, but it was certainly a challenge early on. And then finally, a lack of communication to parents. I think it's notable, very notable, that by the end of this work, parents were very positive about blended learning. And when we surveyed them, the vast majority said that they thought that the work was good for their schools and good for their kids. But there were a lot of questions. Parents had questions around how much time the kids were spending on computers and the balance between teacher time and screen time, right? Like, are the computers just babysitting my kids? They had questions around content. They saw a lot of gamified content. They saw their kids playing a lot of computer games at home, and they said, my kids can play games at home, and I don't know that this is actually doing anything for my kid who's trying to hit the asteroid with the thing, And then finally, some parents just didn't understand what blended learning was. Some of the blended schools actually had an opportunity for parents to come in and experience blended the way that their kids did, and that seemed to help some. But even at the end of this grant period, we got some survey responses from teachers who said, or from parents rather, who said, I'm sorry, but I just don't understand what this is. It wasn't how I did school, and I just need more information still. That said, despite all of those tensions, teachers were really, really optimistic, as were leaders, and I just mentioned parents were as well. 46% of teachers that we surveyed reported that they were more likely to recommend their schools since blended implementation. I should note that only 10% said they were less, so 90% were neutral or positive. And they pointed to some key supports. This is something we hear from both schools, but also every blended school I've ever been in. Observing other schools, teachers and leaders see as really, really helpful. Being able to get your head around what it is, what it looks like, and some supports that make this work in the classroom, right down to routines and procedures, can be very helpful for folks. And building a network with people in those schools as well, who can then be a support system as you run into challenges, can be very helpful. Additionally, ongoing embedded professional development. The both schools were fortunate to have blended learning leads in each school, and those can help ease teachers' fears and help them to troubleshoot new pieces of their job that come with blended learning. So particularly data use is a key one that we hear again and again. There's all of these data that come from the software. I don't know what to do with them. It's overwhelming. And so having someone who can help organize that and make sense of it can help. And then finally, attention to staff morale, perhaps not surprising, but teachers feeling like they're heard was important to them. Okay. So I'll move on to outcomes. And sorry, I'm trying to be really mindful of time here. When we looked at student performance data, no matter how we sliced it, really, we didn't see much of an impact. We saw a little blip here, up, down, there in 6th grade science or 10th grade math in this school or another, but we didn't see consistent trends within or across schools. And, this is a little disappointing probably, but at the same time, I'm not sure. I would be surprised if we had seen a large positive effect, in large part because there was a pretty rocky rollout at the beginning of this grant. And what blended learning was took a while to take shape in these schools. Also, this grant was only 3 years long, so schools were in the early stages of this, and we know with most education reforms, it takes a while to see an effect. And then there were some data challenges as well, where in some cases we only had a few years prior to blended learning implementation, so it would be difficult to see a trend no matter what. Other outcomes, though, in terms of perceived outcomes, were more positive. 85% of teachers believe that blended makes their students more independent learners. This is something that we've seen elsewhere as well. And 92% believe that blended helps their students to learn what they're studying now. So despite the frustrations that teachers had in these schools, they thought it was good for students. And overwhelmingly so. Like, this is shocking. You don't always see numbers like this. The students were a little less consistently positive, but some really did take to the work, particularly younger students. And again, this is something that we've seen in other studies. These are just 2 items from the survey, but these trends were consistent. We asked them about motivation, and students in grades 4 and 5 were more consistently reported that blended learning positively impacted their motivation and positively impacted their learning. And if you look at kind of the negative response, you can see that the inverse is true. Older kids were more negative. You can imagine a number of different reasons for this. One hypothesis is that the software developed for younger students has kind of been around for longer, and there's more of it, and it might be higher quality. The hypothesis that I favor is that older kids have been in school for longer, and they kind of know how to do school, right? So if you're 8 years into the system and you know how to navigate the system, you probably are not taking kindly to the rules being changed all of a sudden. If you're younger, you might be a little bit more adaptable. Another outcome, non-academic outcome that I think is important, or perceived outcome, that I know Rachel is giving a lot of attention and thought to, and others in the blended/personalized learning community are also thinking hard about, is technology's impact on social aspects of learning. And these are stronger results than we've seen from other studies, but about 1/3 of teachers agreed that blended learning limits students' interactions with peers, and that was pretty evenly distributed across schools. And 28% agree that blended limits students' creativity. Notably, this number was pretty concentrated in one school, but it was the school that used blended the most. So these are important.
Do those numbers reflect all grades or specific? Could you separate them between lower school and elementary school and high school?
So that's a good question. This was consistent across grade levels. This was stronger in an elementary school. That answers your question. So this is something that we're giving a lot of thought to, and I think that these numbers and these perceptions are kind of part of the reason why blended learning has now often become referred to as personalized learning, and folks are incorporating other aspects of progressive education into the approach to get at that piece of the work. Okay. So now I will get into the last piece of our study, which was on finances, and hopefully this will tee up what Harry is about to present. This is just an overview of how folks in the school spent the BOLD money. This is school 1, 2, 3, 4 over 3 years. I think that the most obvious thing when you look at this is that spending was much higher in year 1 than the other years. And you might think, okay, this makes sense. There are all of these upfront costs. Consultants, which the funders actually required, is this light green. Tech infrastructure, okay, you need that. Facilities, some training, hardware, software, these are all upfront costs that are somewhat predictable. And you might say, okay, well, it has to be much higher in year 1. But when we look at other finance studies of blended learning that we've done, I should say, pretty much the only other finance study of blended learning that exists that SERPI also did, we did it of Bill and Melinda Gates funded NGLC schools. And when we break it down, we see that the spending is actually much more evenly distributed across years 1 and years 2 in those schools, whereas the BOLD schools really did have this spike. Even though when you added those years of spending, they're pretty much on par, right? In many of the categories, consulting about the same, infrastructure is very different, but they're charter schools.